Today I'd like to talk about the inadequacy of atheism, looking at atheism as a belief system, and looking at some of the serious weaknesses, as Nick alluded to earlier. But before we get going, I guess I'd talk to you about the dyslexic atheist. You're familiar with dyslexia. That's where you move letters around, right? Well, the dyslexic atheist, of course, asserts that there is no dog rather than no God, because he has the problem of the... I actually like the dyslexic agnostic who suffers from insomnia better. He stays up late at night wondering whether there is or isn't a dog, and that is the dyslexic agnostic. I think the place to begin in discussing atheism and talking about some of the inadequacies of atheism is to really give a definition for atheism. Atheism, etymologically, that is, in terms of the origin of the word, comes to us from the Greek language. The Greek word for God is theos. To place an A before that would be atheos, or no God. And so, strictly speaking, atheism is no Godism. No Godism. Standard definition given by the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, given by Webster's Dictionary, is that atheism is the denial of the existence of God or a rejection of belief in God. Now, just as there are varieties of Christians, there are also varieties of atheists. Atheists do not argue the same way all of the time. They argue based upon what it is that grounds their unbelief. Now, you've heard some lectures today about the kinds of things that provide a foundation for believing in Christianity. You've heard some things today about the foundation upon which our faith rests. Well, atheists also attempt to argue their atheism based upon some attempt to ground their thinking in reality. Now, I would argue, as Nick has, that there really isn't a solid foundation at all for atheism, but I want you to be aware that there are a variety of atheisms or atheistic viewpoints. The first one I want to mention is what I call dogmatic atheism. Dogmatic atheism. This is also called offensive atheism. It's the person who simply says, I know God doesn't exist. I would say that the best reflection of this kind of village atheism is reflected in the thinking of somebody like Madalyn Murray O'Hair. This is the kind of self-assertive atheism that we find in the typical atheistic societies. Of course, there's a problem with asserting that God doesn't exist. It's just like when I go to some of my relatives' house. I'm Irish, and so sometimes when some of my relatives drink a little bit too much, they begin to ask me whether there are leprechauns. And it seems that the more whiskey they drink, the more they want to ask about leprechauns. Seems to be a correlation there to some degree. Well, I used to tell them, absolutely not. There are no leprechauns. And then they would ask me, have you looked everywhere? Well, there is a similar difficulty in asserting the non-existence of God. In philosophy and in logic, we call that the attempt to prove a universal negative. There are limitations to disproof. A positive affirmation, like Sacramento is the capital of California, or Madrid is the capital of Spain. These are positive existential statements that can be investigated and checked out. But if I told you that there are no black geese, that would be a much more difficult statement to check out, to prove wrong. And so when the village atheists ask me or assert the fact that there is no God, I simply ask them, how do you know that? How can you with confidence assert that there is no God? So there's a real difficulty there. They run into a dead end, so to speak. And because atheism is a very difficult worldview to defend, And because there are limitations to disproof and the problem of the universal negative, some atheists have become a little more sophisticated in attempting to defend atheism. This leads us to the second variety. I call them defensive atheists, or a atheist that is a little bit more subtle. They would assert that atheism is not rejection of God, but the absence of belief in God. God's existence is not disproven, but unproven. Now I want you to see that subtlety. The defensive atheists, they don't go around saying, I know God does not exist. They simply say, I have an absence of belief in God. I'm not asserting that God has been disproven. I'm simply asserting that God's existence remains unproven. An example in this particular area of epistemological thinking, or thinking that relates to knowledge. One particular atheist, Anthony Flew, he has said, in the lack of evidence of God, then everyone should presume atheism. He is asserting a principle that is similar to the courtroom procedure, that one is to be presumed innocent before one is found guilty in a court of law. Anthony Flew says one should simply presume atheism until somebody comes along with a knockdown argument for God. Now I want you to think about this definition a little bit. According to the defensive atheists, atheism is in fact not rejection of belief in God. They're not asserting that God does not exist. They're simply saying, I have an absence of belief in God, and therefore I am simply asserting that God's existence is unproven. Here we would have certain examples. I think George Smith, in his book, The Case Against God, would be a very good example of a defensive atheist. And also, Dr. Gordon Stein would be a good example of defensive atheists. Now, let me offer a criticism of this definition of atheism. First of all, to say that atheism is not disbelief in God or the rejection of God, but merely the absence of belief in God, is to create a stipulative definition. In logic, a stipulative definition is when you invent a definition for a word for the first time. That is, this is a non-standard definition for atheism. To say that you don't reject belief in God, or you don't believe in God, but merely have an absence of belief, this is not the standard definition for atheism. In fact, the editor of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Paul Edwards, is himself an ardent atheist, and he defines atheism as rejection of God, disbelief in God. Secondly, now let's talk about this absence of belief in God. God's not disproven, God's unproven. That's their assertion. Well, when I reflect upon that for a moment, if I say God's existence is unproven, as the defensive atheists assert, it would seem to me that an unproven proposition or an unproven statement, i.e., God exists, if it is unproven, then there are three possible options. It may remain unproven, it may become disproven, or it may become proven. That is, to take the defensive atheist position, it doesn't seem to be any different from agnosticism. To say I have an absence of belief in God, God remains unproven but not disproven, that to me really is the essence of agnosticism. And of course, agnosticism, coming to us again from the Greek, gnosis is one of the Greek words for knowledge. You place an A in front of it, you negate it. So agnosis, or agnosticism, is the belief that one does not or cannot know ultimate reality, especially God. Agnosticism is an inability to determine whether God exists because of an alleged insufficiency of knowledge. Now, the problem with that is, that seems to be what the defensive atheists are saying. They're saying God's existence isn't proven. Well, if it's not proven, then it may become proven, or it may become disproven. And so I think not only does the dogmatic atheist position crumble epistemologically, again, when you deal with knowledge and the issue of knowledge or question of knowledge, but defensive atheism really seems like an effort to try to dodge the problems with atheism. And so they go into some type of agnosticism. Now, the third type of atheism is what I'm going to call philosophical atheism. And this is certainly a more reflective approach to atheism. Philosophical atheism simply says that God's existence should be rejected because belief in God reduces to absurdity. They simply say there are no good reasons to believe in God, or belief in God is fundamentally flawed. Now, they would take several different arguments, thus their unbelief is grounded in one of three ways. A philosophical atheist may say, God is a meaningless concept. That is, when we talk about the term God, God has no meaning. It's an arf. It has no definition or meaning to it. Of course, the problem with that is that is based upon an early 20th century approach to philosophy called analytic philosophy, and their verification principle was something only has meaning if it can be defined or if it can be verified through the five senses. So statements like black cats are black has meaning. Triangles have three sides has meaning. Bachelors or unmarried men has meaning because what is in the predicate is already in the subject. And they would say things that can be seen or heard, smelled, tasted, or touched have meaning. But the idea of God has no definitional meaning and God has no empirical meaning. Well, the problem with that is the idea of the verification principle itself. That is, the idea that something only has meaning if you can define it in terms of tautology, or something only has meaning if you can define it empirically. The verification principle itself can't be seen. That is to say, I only believe in something if you can define it or see it, cannot itself be seen. So the idea that God is a meaningless concept is fraught with problems. By the way, every time you address an atheist and say the term God, it seems to have some meaning for him. He tells us that God doesn't exist. If God had no meaning, then he couldn't tell us anything at all. So he seems to contradict himself. Secondly, some philosophical atheists will say that the concept of God is incoherent. Something is incoherent if it is internally inconsistent, if it is logically contradictory. And they will say that if you think about an omnipotent, an all-powerful God, and an omniscient God, that these characteristics, these attributes are somehow contradictory. Of course, the problem is that classical Christian philosophers, such as Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, and a whole list of modern Christian philosophers of religion have pointed out that these attributes do not in fact contradict themselves. Again, the reference earlier about the immovable object and the irresistible force. That question by its very nature is contradictory. Now, thirdly, some philosophical atheists ground their atheism in the idea that belief in God is incompatible with either our knowledge of science or our knowledge of evil. And because I'm going to deal with science in a few minutes, I want to say something about the issue of evil. Reformed Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga has pointed out that there's no incompatibility between the existence of God in the world on one hand and belief in an omnibenevolent, omnipotent God. That is, some would say if God was all-powerful, he could get rid of evil. If God was omnibenevolent, all-loving and kind, he would get rid of evil. But since evil still exists, either God is not good or God is not all-powerful. In fact, that's what the Scottish skeptical philosopher of the 18th century, David Hume, said. He said, look, you've either got to have a God who's good but not all-powerful, or an all-powerful God who's not good, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. Well, philosophers like Alvin Plantinga have pointed out that there is no incompatibility with that. God has created a world that contains evil. And God, because he is omniscient, has a very good reason to allow evil. Therefore, evil exists in the world. There's no logical tension between the existence of evil, on one hand, and the nature of the Christian God. Secondly, oftentimes atheists attempt to use evil as the dagger in the heart of Christian belief. But in reality, evil is a proof of God. And you say to yourself, how is that possible? Well, if you assert that something is evil, if you say torturing children for the fun of it is evil, if you say rape is evil, if you say mass murder is evil, you are presupposing a transcendental ground of goodness by which to judge something good or evil. That is, in an atheistic world, in order to call something evil, you have to have some benchmark. You have to have some appeal to the transcendental. And so all of these years, Christians have been troubled by the fact that evil was somehow a great force against the faith. Christian philosophers have been capable of pointing out that to call something evil, you have to have an understanding of goodness. And if you think, as I do, torturing children for the fun of it is evil, you have to appeal to a ground of goodness by which to judge them. Who would some of the philosophical atheists be? Examples would be Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, Karl Marx, the father of the communist movement, the psychoanalytic leader in the 20th century, Sigmund Freud, the greatest educator of the 19th and 20th century in America, the man who single-handedly transformed public education in America, a man named John Dewey, the French existentialist, philosopher, and playwright Jean-Paul Sartre, the Oxford philosopher in the 20th century, J.L. Mackie. I mentioned Antony Flew, who is still alive today, and of course Kai Nielsen and Paul Edwards, the editor of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. These men are all brilliant individuals, but as we'll see in a few minutes, atheism is not necessarily something that is arrived from a lack of intelligence. These men are intelligent men. But intelligent men can sometimes come to deeply flawed viewpoints. Now, in looking at atheism, I want to connect atheism to its natural worldview. And when I use the term worldview, I mean a grid, a conceptual grid for understanding reality. A worldview is how you make sense of the world. A worldview is how you interpret reality. I like to think of a worldview as the Christian philosopher Ronald Nash says, and that is, a worldview is like a pair of glasses. For those of you who wear glasses all the time, as opposed to somebody like me who wears only sunglasses, that time is coming, I'm afraid, where I will have to wear glasses almost all of the time. But you know, as a person who wears glasses, that you see everything through the lenses of those glasses. Everything comes into you through the lenses of the glasses. The glasses interpret the world for you. Well, all of us have a worldview. All of us interpret reality, and I'm going to give you an illustration of how a worldview can either bring you closer to reality or it can push you further away. I was watching television late at night because I suffer from insomnia, and television, about the only thing it's good for is helping you to fall asleep. And so I was watching, and they had a commercial on blue blocker sunglasses. And it was very appealing to me, and my wife was asleep, so I could allow my impulsive shopper attitude to come out. And there was even a guy on there who was giving a jingle and a rap song about the blue blockers, and I thought, boy, these must be great. They must be the next thing to slice bread. So I got my credit card out, and I ordered a pair of blue blocker sunglasses. Well, when I got them, I took them out of the case and I put them on. I was standing in my backyard. It was a very sunny day. And when I put the glasses on, I had the impression like there was no lenses in the glasses. That is, it seemed like everything was clearer. It seemed like my focus of reality was clearer. Reality was brought closer to me. I could also look almost up into the sun, and usually even when your eyes come near the sun, there is all of the haze and it's difficult to do, but I was able to look very close to the sun and it took a lot of the haze away. So in one sense, that pair of glasses brought me closer to reality, or at least that was my perception. Now later, however, I realized that there are certain problems with blue blocker sunglasses. First of all, they distort color. I was in a little snack shop at Cerritos College where I teach, and they have this little room called the elbow room where you can go in and buy a snack in between class. And so being a philosopher, I was looking for some chewing gum, and I wanted juicy fruit. The natural selection of all true philosophers is juicy fruit. You may not know that, but that's true. And if anybody comes up here and tells you otherwise, you know they're not a true philosopher, right? Well, they had this big jar of Wrigley's chewing gum, and it was very large, and so I was looking into the jar, and if I wasn't reading, I was looking for the color yellow. And it seemed like all the packs of gum were white, or they were green. So I said to the lady who was working there, I said, you know, you run this place, you have all of these packs of Wrigley's chewing gum, and you have no juicy fruit? And she looked at me, she looked at the jar, she looked at me, and she said, you're a philosophy teacher, right? No, she didn't say that. She said, sir, there is juicy fruit throughout the bottle. So I took my glasses off. Sure enough, there were plenty of juicy fruit in there. My glasses distort color. It makes yellow look white. It makes orange look pink. This, of course, illustrates that a poor worldview can also push you further away from reality. A good worldview will tighten your focus. An inadequate worldview will take you further away. Well, what is the worldview upon which atheism rests? It is the worldview known as naturalism. Naturalism. Naturalism is the belief system that regards the natural, material, and physical universe as the only reality. Nature is the whole show, so to speak. Naturalism is characterized by monism. Monism is the belief that all reality is one. Materialism, the belief that matter is the sole reality, that everything can be reduced to or explainable in terms of matter. Naturalism is also anti-supernatural. They believe that everything happens naturally, physically, materially, chemically. There is nothing above the natural world. And they believe in scientism, which is not science. Scientism is the belief that science is the only reliable knowledge. And lastly, they're humanistic. They believe that man is the measure of all things. Now, in looking at naturalism would say this. Naturalism would say that everything, things, people, events, can be reduced to matter in motion. Everything is just the chemical, electrical, physical reactions that are taking place in the world. Everything is reducible to or explainable in terms of physics, chemistry, and biology. They would say only physical matter exists. The physical universe is the only thing that exists, and therefore everything is explainable in light of physics, chemistry, and biology. There's no God, because God is an infinite, eternal, personal spirit. Spirits do not exist. Angels do not exist. Human beings do not have immaterial souls. And so naturalism is the worldview that underlies this. Now, in taking this a step further, there are plenty of people who are atheistic. We mentioned some of them. Somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre would argue this way. Someone like Karl Marx would argue this way. Someone like Sigmund Freud would argue this way. And of course, it's difficult to underestimate the influence of somebody like a Freud or somebody like a Marx. Now, they would say that science makes belief in God unnecessary. Science makes belief in God unnecessary, and this is the assertion that the modern scientific person really doesn't have to believe in God any longer. God was a crutch that was used by people early in life as an explanation of the mysteries in nature. And so I want to talk a little bit about these two rival theories about God. The first one, of course, is the atheistic position. It's best reflected in what I call the magic theory. The magic theory. And it's seen in James Frazier's book, The Golden Bough. James Frazier said, this is where the concept of God came from. The cavemen wandered out of their caves and began hunting and gathering and foraging, and they experienced certain mysteries in nature, thunder and lightning, earthquakes, natural phenomena, and they said to themselves, it must have been the crocodile god. And thus they had a magical way of looking at the world. They thought there were spirits and entities in the ocean and spirits in the wind. And so nature is filled with these spirits or gods. And of course they would say, that's the belief in magic. It's superstition. And so God, according to this atheistic position, was invented as an explanation for the mysteries in the universe. Now, they take us a little further down their timeline. They say the cavemen held to kind of a magical theory. And of course, now we know in modern science that thunder is not God moving the furniture around. It is the vacuum that is created and the closing of the vacuum. They say, and if you trace the timeline a little bit further, you find in the medieval period the place where the Christian church was the dominant force in Western civilization. And now religion is just a little bit more of a sophisticated magical theory. Religion tries to give sophistication to superstition, is what the atheists would say. And then, of course, with the coming of the 18th century and the Enlightenment period and the development of modern science, now people throw off religion just as they threw off the magic of the cavemen. And nobody who is scientifically informed would believe in God. Science is now our way of understanding the mysteries in nature. We don't have to assume God. Now, that's certainly one model, isn't it? And if you go to a college or university, a secular variety, you will certainly hear that explanation of God. If you take a psych class, you will hear people say that Sigmund Freud thought that religious people were suffering from an infantile neurosis. Let me give you an interpretation of that. He means that religious people are people who have simply refused to grow up. And we kind of hold on to God the way Linus would hold on to his blanket. And Freud said human beings are incessantly religious, and they're basically afraid, and if they became more scientifically minded, they would give up the superstition that is religion. Well, you hear this theory frequently in psych classes. I had a student who was in my philosophy class and was simultaneously taking a psychology class. And so the psych professor came over and said, I don't know if you should take Professor Sample's philosophy class. And the student, being somewhat gullible, said, well, why? He said, well, don't you know, if you study too much philosophy, you'll go insane. So the student came to me and said, is it true that if you study too much philosophy, you might go insane? And I said, well, you might, but if you study psychology, psychologists and psychiatrists have the highest rate of suicide. So I said, if you stay with me, you might go insane, but if you stay with him, you might die. He's still very troubled by this event. No. Now, setting aside the atheistic model, the magic theory, where we go from magic religion into the modern scientific world, let me then give the biblical viewpoint of the nature of God and the origin of God. The Bible says that God, an infinite, eternal, tripersonal spirit, exists as an objective reality apart from our mind and apart from our will. And that this God, who is the transcendent creator and immanent sustainer of the world, has revealed himself through the Old and New Testament scriptures. And therefore, the Bible would assert that there is an objective and historical basis for believing in God. Who is God? God is a personal spiritual being who revealed himself to people like Noah, to people like Abraham, to people like Moses, and revealed himself to them and told him that he was the eternal God. And therefore, God's not something that we have contracted because our Aunt Louise locked us in a closet. God is not the product, as Karl Marx said, of the rich ruling class wanting to oppress the poor. It doesn't have anything to do with economics. God is an objective being that existed prior to the creation of the universe. By the way, there are some people, principally feminists, who would say that God was created by men in order to oppress women. That's an interesting theory that's floating across the colleges and universities. Well, the Bible says that God exists independent of the created order, and that our mind and our will does not affect him. In fact, his mind and his will affects us. Well, what I'd like to do now is I would like to talk about why God's existence is necessary in the scientific world, why it is necessary to believe in God, and why without God there is a tremendous unfolding of all of our beliefs. Now, the first point I make, and again, this is reasons why God remains necessary in the scientific world. The first point I want to make is, without the biblical God, there's no basis for science. You see, I would assert the opposite of the atheist. The atheist would say, well, science has made God unnecessary. I would assert, without the biblical God, there's no foundation for science whatsoever. Assume the position of atheism for a moment, that God does not exist, that the universe has come into existence, however it has, over billions and billions of years by blind, non-purposeful, mechanistic natural processes. The universe is simply the product of chemistry, physics, biology. Well, here's my question. How could you ever have science in that situation? How would you ever have the order, the uniformity of nature? How would you ever have something other than chaos and strife? That is, how can you ever assert in an atheistic world that is here by chance, by naturalistic processes, by blind mechanistic processes, how could you ever assert the uniformity of nature? Now, the uniformity of nature is a scientific principle that basically says that nature is uniform in the same way that it has in a prior condition. And therefore, you can drop a pin today, or tomorrow, or the next day, or you could have dropped the pin yesterday or the day before, and because of gravity, the pin would fall to the floor. And that there won't be a day when you drop a pin and it flies up. That's the uniformity of nature. Well, here we get some help from actually skeptical philosophers. Skeptical philosopher named David Hume, joined by another skeptical philosopher, Immanuel Kant, said, you can never assert that nature will be uniform without begging the question. Now, this takes a little bit of explanation. David Hume and Immanuel Kant said, you can never know that the sun will rise tomorrow based upon your knowledge that the sun has risen today or rose in the past. Now think about that for a moment. How would you know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Skeptical philosophers Hume and Kant would say, you can never know that the sun will rise tomorrow. And of course, we're speaking phenomenologically. The sun doesn't rise, but scientists speak that way, and thus the Bible speaks that way. Phenomenological language, speaking of it as the phenomenon appears to us. We know that the earth rotates, we know that the sun does not rise, but we use those expressions, and so do scientists. Well, how do you know the sun's going to come up tomorrow? Well, you can't say you know it because it's always come up in the past, because if you say it's going to come up tomorrow because it's always come up in the past, you are already assuming that tomorrow will be like today, and that's the point you're arguing. So you have begged the question. You have assumed what you should have proven. You can't argue that the sun will rise tomorrow because it rose today or yesterday. Because when you use yesterday or today to forecast tomorrow, you're already assuming the uniformity of nature. And so, without God, because with God, you in fact do have the guarantee that nature will respond. Science has certain foundations. The naturalistic, atheistic worldview has no foundation for asserting the uniformity of nature. Science has no firm foundation. And you see, that's exactly what we need to say and we need to assert. That without the Christian worldview, without the Christian God, science has no firm foundation. Talk about principles of causality. How is there principles of causality? Are you going to assert they're just inherent in material property itself? On what basis would you assert that? Science is based upon certain principles, but those principles need a foundation, and that foundation is the Christian theistic view of God. Biblical God, there's no basis for the laws of logic. The laws of logic. You heard earlier about the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction simply says A cannot equal A and non-A at the same time and in the same way. Something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same way. Sometimes I tell my students, and I get a faraway look in my eye, and I try to play the part of a philosopher, and I kind of put my hand up to my temple, and I say, I exist, but I don't exist. And I just kind of have this faraway look. And I say, what do you think of that? And of course they look at me, and they say, wow, that's heavy. I say, no, it's not heavy. It's absurd. It doesn't make any sense. If I exist, then that negates or denies my non-existence. And if I don't exist, that negates or denies my existence. The law of non-contradiction would say that certain things can be and other things cannot be. Well, I would assert that in a world without God, you cannot have the laws of logic. Now stay with me here. If the naturalists are right in asserting that everything is made of physical, material matter, if everything can be reduced to chemistry, physics, and biology, then you don't have thoughts in your mind. You don't have intentional, uncoerced thoughts. You didn't decide to come here today. You didn't decide to purchase the car you purchased. You didn't decide to eat the breakfast you ate. Why? You have no ability to have uncoerced thinking because you don't have thoughts. You have chemical, electrical reactions in your brain, and you do not choose those. Those happen through our process of genetics and the unfolding nature of the chemical and electrical nature of our brain. You didn't even choose to be a Christian. It was the electrical chemical reactions in your brain that caused it. You didn't choose to marry a blonde or a brunette or a redhead. Of course, they'd have to have a choice in the matter unless there was a chemical reaction in their brain. But the assertion is, if we reduce everything to physics, chemistry, and biology, then there is no thinking at all. I find it strange that atheists will sometimes say that the evidence that has led them to atheism is solid reasons. Well, in an atheistic, naturalistic world, there's no way of thinking. It's just chemical reactions in your brain. And so thinking as we know it in an atheistic, naturalistic world is not possible. That's excellent reason for rejecting it. Now, stay with me here. There was a philosopher, Richard Taylor, and he gave an illustration, and I'm going to modify his illustration a little bit, about the issue of evolution and the issue of the human brain and the issue of knowledge. Now, suppose we decide to take a field trip. And we're going to take a field trip the best you can. We're going to take it in our minds. Those are sometimes the best field trip to take. Suppose that we took a field trip down to San Diego because we want to visit the zoo. And suppose as we were going down the Amtrak and discussing issues of Christian apologetics, we looked up on a hill and written seemingly in nice, shiny white rocks was the seeming sign or symbol, San Diego 10 miles, and then it had an arrow. Now, you being the very clever person you are, you say, San Diego is 10 miles away. But the conductor walks in at that point and he says, I really hate to tell you that you're really not 10 miles from San Diego. That is really not a sign out there on the hilltop. A couple years ago, we had a major earthquake down here, and all of the rocks were just scattered in random, chaotic directions, and it just landed on the hill that way. Now, first of all, you wouldn't believe that, but let's say you're really kind of dull. You're a dull Christian, okay? You're an anti-intellectual Christian. Of course, you're not, or you wouldn't be here today, but let's pretend you're not a very sharp Christian. And let's pretend that I'm not either. And so we say, wow, you mean it happened by chance? You mean it's a blind mechanistic process? The conductor says yes. Here's the question that Richard Taylor has for you. If you came to believe that the so-called sign on the hill had happened by chance, blind mechanistic process, how many of you would still believe you're 10 miles from San Diego? Now, before you answer that, let me give you the right answer. You should never believe you're 10 miles from San Diego because you never believe things that happen by chance. You would only believe you were 10 miles from San Diego if you believed that there was a mind behind the sign. We believe in signs because we believe an intelligent mind has placed them there. Now, near where I live, there's a little turn in the road. We go down a highway, and I was driving along about 50 miles an hour, and it said you should go 35 as you make this little hook in the road. And I thought, well, 50 it's almost 35, so I'll just go 50. When I got into the turn, I recognized immediately why you should drive 35 miles an hour. Now, the reason I stop at stoplights, the reason why I obey traffic lights, is because I believe there is an intelligence behind the signs. If I thought some hooligans had come around and turned the signs, I wouldn't pay any attention to them. And thus, I think traffic signs have intelligence behind them. I'm not going to ask what intelligence level Caltrans workers have, but nevertheless, a sign becomes a sign, a code becomes a code, a message becomes a message, because there's an intelligent mind behind it. Now, therefore, I and you should discount the so-called sign on the hill because it's not a sign. Here's the further question. If God does not exist, and if nature is the sole reality, and if everything, all life on this planet has evolved over billions of years, then your brain has also evolved over billions of years. Now, if your brain has come by pure chance, if your brain is the product of blind mechanistic processes, then your brain is no more designed than the sign on the hill. If you don't trust the bricks on the hill, as an atheist, as an evolutionist, why should you ever trust your brain? Why should you ever believe that your brain is actually communicating truthful things? Thus I assert, without the biblical God, there's no basis for the mind. There's no basis for human reasoning. Third, without the biblical God, there's no basis for human freedom. Again, if materialism is true, if everything is reduced back to physical matter, and if you and I are just matter in motion, if everything is explicable according to physics, chemistry, and biology, then there is no freedom of the will. There is no human volition. You did not come here today by your own uncoerced decision. You came here today because you had an electrical chemical reaction in your brain. All of your decisions are not free at all. They're all coerced. And thus everything reduces to chemistry. Everything reduces to biology and to physics. And therefore, without the biblical God, there's no science, there's no laws of logic. Without the biblical God, human freedom is gone. Because again, this is what thinking is. Genuine, authentic human thinking is when we, uncoerced, use our own intention to decide to do A and to avoid B, or to do A or to refrain from A. And if everything reduces to physics, chemistry, and biology, then even your beliefs reduce to physical, chemical, electrical reactions in your brain. That means that you're a Christian not because you chose to be one, and the atheist is not an atheist because he chose to be one, but because of electrical, chemical reactions in their brain. It means that freedom is completely gone. Fourth, without the biblical God, there's no basis for morality. Nick mentioned earlier the problems. In a naturalistic world, in a world without God, what one animal does to another animal is of no significant consequence. Hitler thought annihilating the Jews was right. The Jews think it's wrong. Who's to say? All ethics become conventional, man-made. They're arbitrary. You know, if you're an atheist and you want to become a Mother Teresa, well, that's fine. But if you'd like to become a Charles Manson, that's fine too. It's completely arbitrary. We often assume that an atheist will gravitate toward ethics that are constructive, but my question is why? I mean, why can't I get on the 405 freeway, go about 120 miles an hour? I'm not sure my car would go that fast. But go 120, get about 8 or 9 CHP cars behind me, then slam on the brakes, and then right before they beat me, I say to them, who are you to judge me? I'm here by blind, mechanistic, natural processes. I'm all about traffic accidents. I didn't vote for you. I don't even believe in democracy. I'm all about death. I always wanted to try that, but one, I'm a coward, and two, I have Christian ethics that cause problems. So I'm wondering maybe if one day I won't see one of my students out there doing that. I hope they don't trace it back to me at that point. Well, you see, if there is no God, then all ethics are made up. They're all conventional. They're arbitrary. There's no difference between being a Mother Teresa or an Adolf Hitler. They're relativistic. Well, relativistic ethics can be summed up in the phrase, whatever a person thinks is right is right. Therefore, Martin Luther King was right to condemn discrimination in the South, but so was the Klan when they asserted that discrimination against blacks was right. In the 1840s, some Southerners said that blacks were not full human beings. Well, what if whatever a person thinks is right, then in fact, those Southerners were right. But so were the Northerners who asserted that blacks were human beings. And of course, if whatever a person thinks is right, it means everybody is right, and if everybody is right, then it means nobody is wrong. There's no foundation for ethics. What one animal does to another has no real consequence. In an atheistic, naturalistic, materialistic world, what is the difference between annihilating 6 million Jews and annihilating 6 million mosquitoes? We are all the product of physical and chemical evolution. And thus I assert without the biblical God, there's no basis for morality. Now, the assertion was made earlier, without God, all things are permissible. I think that's the logical conclusion to draw. If God doesn't exist, go for the gusto. Why should a person believe in God? Well, without belief in God, there's no science, there's no foundation for the laws of logic, no foundation for human reasoning, no foundation for morality. Thus, atheism begins to crumble. It becomes an inadequate belief system built upon a worldview that is utterly inadequate, one that should be rejected. Now, in contrast, let's take a look at the sufficiency of the Christian worldview. Thus, I'm asserting the inadequacy of the atheistic naturalistic worldview. Now I'm going to assert the sufficiency of the Christian worldview. If you are a Christian, it's by the grace of God. But if you are a Christian, you have a belief system and a worldview that in fact can stand up. you have a foundation for the things that atheism and naturalism lack. Number one, science is possible because God has brought forth and sustains an objective and orderly universe. Science is quite easy to explain in terms of a biblical model. There is an eternal, unchanging, infinite being who has created the universe, and he sustains it. God is not just the creator. The Bible asserts that God also sustains the universe. He is in control of it, and he has created an objective universe. He has created an orderly universe. And we can assert that tomorrow will be like today based upon the orderly and sovereign nature of the control of God. And thus science has a firm foundation. By the way, in looking at science, allow me to quote just a few people who were leading people in the development of modern science, and all of these people happen to be creationists. All of the scientists I'm about to mention believed that God created the universe, but of course our atheist friends, they tell us that no scientifically minded person could ever believe in creation. Well, how about Johann Kepler in the area of astronomy? How about Blaise Pascal, maybe the most brilliant scientist to ever live, if he had not died at 39 years old? He dealt in the whole area of the adding machine. And in hydrostatics, the idea of measuring the equality in the particular field. How about Boyle in chemistry? I always felt studying chemistry that it was a rather Boyle, but that need to be pierced, I might add. But chemistry, Boyle. How about Newton in physics? Steno, stratigraphy. Faraday, magnetic theory. Babbage in computers. Agassiz in ichthyology, that's the study of icky things. No, that's not. That's the study of insects. Simpson, not OJ, in the area of gynecology. Mendel in genetics. Pasteur, bacteriology. Kelvin in thermodynamics. Lister in antiseptic surgery. Maxwell in electrodynamics. And Ramsey in isotopic chemistry. Well, if you're familiar with the development of modern science, you know that this is a who's who. These men didn't have a problem in believing that science and God were compatible, and nor should you. Secondly, the laws of logic stem from the mind of God. Thus, human beings have the capacity to think because they're created in the image of an infinite, eternal, and personal God. We have what is called in Latin, the imago Dei. We are created in the image of God. We have the ability to reason. We have the ability to make moral choices. We are relational creatures. The great Christian philosopher Augustine, who may have been the greatest Christian thinker to ever live, said that when we think, we encounter the mind of God. We think God's thoughts after him. And when we believe logical, accepted truths, we believe and know what God knows. Third, human freedom, intention, and morality are provided by the fact that God has created us as free moral agents. Adam and Eve had the freedom to choose to obey or to disobey. And thus, our ability to make moral choices is founded on the principle that we're created in the image of an infinite, eternal, and personal God. 4, God remains necessary to explain the world, science, human rationality, freedom, and morality. And I would certainly like the scientific naturalist to explain why Kepler, Newton, Pascal, and many others would have been the real founders of science and at the same time believed in the principle that God and science work together. Allow me, if you will, to summarize the inadequacy of atheism. Naturalistic atheism lacks sufficient explanatory power. Explanatory power is a feature of a worldview. If your belief system is to be accepted, it should be able to explain certain things. If I come over to your house on Saturday afternoon and knock at the door, dressed in a snappy suit, and say to you, I'd like you to consider my new religion. and you say, well, come on in, I've got a tract, and I'm going to try it out on you. And so you say, well, what are the beliefs of your system? And I said, well, one of the beliefs of my system is that the physical material universe doesn't exist. You say, well, then who am I talking to? Right? That is, a sound worldview, a sound system of belief should be able to explain the world. We heard earlier about the cosmological argument. The sound worldview should be able to explain the different experiences of life, things like thought, things like love, things like science and morality. The atheistic, naturalistic worldview lacks sufficient explanatory power. Where did the universe come from? They don't know. And they're not going to be able to know unless they consider a worldview that can provide a basis. Secondly, a naturalistic atheism is incoherent. You don't choose to be an atheist. If you're a naturalistic atheist, you don't choose anything because you can't think. So don't come over and tell the Christians that you're smarter than them, and if they were smart like you, they'd be a naturalistic atheist, because if you're a naturalistic atheist, you don't think. You just have physical, chemical reactions in your brain. But you know what's interesting is that no matter where you go on this planet, if you go to North America, South America, if you go to Europe, if you go to Asia, if you go to Africa, if you go to Antarctica or Australia, you find that human beings can communicate with each other. The human beings can manipulate and understand symbols, and they can use language to move from symbols to thought and idea. If I can use the language of computers, it would appear that human beings are all networked together. Now, in a naturalistic, materialistic worldview, that cannot be accounted for. Your brain has evolved along different lines than my brain. You have a different brain in your head than I have in mine. You have different chemical and electrical reactions in your brain than I do in my mind. How is it even possible to have any communication? You certainly cannot think. And so I say naturalistic atheism is incoherent. And every time the atheist says atheism is superior to Christianity, you've got them. Because if they're an atheistic naturalist, they have no basis for thinking anything. And a worldview where people can't think, though we don't always have enough thinking in the church, I might add, but a worldview in which has no provision for thinking is not a worldview worth having. Third, atheism, naturalistic atheism, fails to correspond to the present state of affairs. No explanation for science. You see, I think the skeptical philosophers of David Hume and Immanuel Kant have nailed them. You need a foundation for science. Number 4, naturalistic atheism is overly simplistic, the reductive fallacy. It means that it means that Michelangelo's David. It means that Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. It means the emergence of modern science. It means the Reformation, the Renaissance. It means everything is simply chemistry, physics, and biology. That's the reductive fallacy. How about issues like love? How about issues like thought? How about issues that are relevant to an intelligible experience? And so the atheists have committed the reductive fallacy. 5, naturalistic atheism is a Johnny One Note. That is, they lack a broad line of evidence. Everything is reducive to chemistry, physics, and biology. 6, naturalistic atheism cannot refute its rival, the Christian theistic worldview. You see, we have a basis for saying we can think. We have a basis for saying that we have the freedom of the will. We can make moral choices. There's a basis for logic. There's a basis for science. They have no basis. 7, naturalistic atheism is existentially unsatisfactory. Albert Camus, the leading atheistic existentialist playwright, said, in an atheistic world, in a world where God is dead, there's only one question: why not commit suicide? Interesting way of putting it. Why not commit suicide? Well, if we are simply the unfolding of evolution, if we are simply the chance concurrence of atoms in a universe that has no meaning and significance, then what is the meaning of life? Life in an atheistic world builds a sense of despair. And this is reflected in the atheistic philosophy of existentialism. It's reflected when we begin to think that I'm going to die. And I'm going to die soon. In fact, I'm going to die about 45 minutes earlier than when I began talking to you. And every turn of the second hand on the clock brings you closer to death. And so we're going to die. We're going to die soon. Even some of you young whippersnappers, you will find as you get a little bit older that time moves a little bit more quickly when you get into your 30s and 40s and 50s, and even faster when you're in 60s and 70s. So you're going to die, the atheistic existential worldview says. You're going to die soon, and you're going to die alone, and you're going to die forever. That is a world that leaves one with estrangement. It is a worldview that leaves one in despair. It has no hope. But Christianity, on the other hand, is the religion of hope. It is the religion of resurrection. We are not of all men most miserable, because Christ is risen indeed. The last point I want to make is that naturalistic atheism is closer to superstition than science. Some of my colleagues in the philosophy department don't always particularly like that when I assert it. But I tell them, straight-faced, that atheism is really a kind of superstition. It's a belief without foundation. It's not scientific. It's much closer to superstition. And how could I close without a reference to the Scriptures? If you have your Bible, and I hope you do, I'd like to give you a brief biblical evaluation of atheism. And so I want to take you to the book of Psalms. You always got to watch those philosophy instructors, make sure they quote the Bible and quote it correctly. Go with me to Psalm 14, verse 1. Here we have an assessment of the atheistic condition. The psalmist says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The term fool does not mean unintelligent. Certainly people like Jean-Paul Sartre, John Dewey were intelligent men. Paul Edwards, Kai Nielsen, J.L. Mackie were intelligent men. The word fool means a moral and spiritual density. A moral and spiritual density. And of course, that's what sin does. Sin causes our thinking to be futile. Sin alienates and separates us from God. And it is God's grace that must come into our life and open our hearts and open our mind. And as Paul says in Ephesians, we're saved by grace and through faith. And it's not of ourselves. It's a gift of God. The atheist suffers from a moral and spiritual density. If I could also take you to Psalm 19. We find something very interesting in Psalm 19 that talks about the nature of God and the knowledge of God. In Psalm 19, verse 1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." Creation is not just there. Creation is there with an exclamation point. Creation testifies to the existence of God. You know, those of you who live down here in the beach, near the beach, don't take the beach for granted. Look at the wonder of the Pacific Ocean that God has made and recognize that God is speaking to you and to all of us in that beautiful ocean that we see. If you live out where I do, near the desert, you see the mountain range, you realize that God is testifying. And as one philosopher Leibniz said, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, there is something because a personal God brought it into existence. Then look at verse 2. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Creation speaks to us. Now you don't go over to a tree, turn the leaf over, and it says, God exists. You go, wow. It's a non-propositional language. That is, it's not language in words. It's not language that is conveyed conceptually that way. It is a knowledge that in fact comes to one through a sense or evaluation of nature. And thus it comes day to day. God is speaking to the atheist day to day. Now if I could close by looking at a couple passages in the New Testament. I'd like you to go to the book of Romans, where the great Apostle Paul teaches us something about unbelief in God. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed. God's anger is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. That is, the sinful man suppresses the truth. They push it down. Verse 19, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. The great biblical theologian John Calvin said that all of us possess a sense of the divine. And those who deny it must consistently and continually push it down. God has not left himself without a witness. He reveals himself in nature. He reveals himself in you. You know, I'm pretty fond of the Pacific Ocean, and I'm awfully fond of this mountain range near where I live called the San Jacinto Mountains. But when I look at you, I see the image of God. I see the image of Almighty God reflected. God testifies to us of his objective existence through nature, but he also speaks to us in the still, small voice of our conscience. And he speaks to us day by day. And he tells us that only a fool, only someone who is morally and spiritually dense would deny the existence of Almighty God. Atheism is inadequate. Christian theism is a sufficient worldview. You have good reason, and you should be quite confident in your faith, because Christianity can stand up to rigorous scientific, philosophical, and historical investigation. God has given us a witness in his word, and his Spirit testifies to our spirit that Jesus is the Son of God, and the Bible is his word. Amen.